Alright, we're going to be upgrading the front suspension on the Ryca CS-1 Cafe Racer. This is an optional upgrade. It's not necessary, but we think it firms up the ride and helps for having the bike a more sporty feel. And here on the left we have the progressive springs, and on the right here we have the stock springs. As you can see, the progressive springs are much thicker. And the top caps and the washers, and some fork oil, and some coffee, necessary if you're doing this at 8 in the morning. On the right here we have the stock spacers. If you're not sure what I'm talking about here, you can watch our other video on lowering the front forks, and you'll see where these spacers are. Here's the stock spacers, and here's the spacers on the left that we've cut 1 inch off of. With the progressive springs, it's necessary to cut at least 1 inch off, but no more than 1.5 inches. You need to really get rid of some of the preload on these springs because they're pretty stiff as is. I cut 1 inch off. Still a pretty firm ride. I may cut off 1.5 inches, but for now I'm just doing 1 inch. It's important to cut these spacers with something like a cutoff tool or something of that nature. Make sure that they're perfectly flat and cut off smooth at the top and exactly even. So I have actually rounded them off on the lathe to make sure that they were smooth, but you can use a cutoff tool and a file and just make sure they're perfectly flat and that they're perfectly even. That's important. They got to be level left to right. So once you have those cut, we're going to drop the progressive springs down into the forks. And then after that, we're going to put the top washers in to the fork tubes. These are going to be followed by, we're going to fill the forks up with fork oil. I use automatic transmission fluid because it's readily available and it's very thin. The viscosity is real thin. I prefer the ride. So here the washers are down. Make sure they sit flat. Compress the front forks at this point down short when you fill them up to top it off with fluid. You want to compress it so that the springs are right up near the top. And you're going to fill the forks up with fork oil right up to the bottom of the threads. If you do this right, the fork should have, I think it's 16 ounces per fork, or 15 point something ounces per fork is the factory spec. So once you fill up the forks with the fork oil up to the bottom of the threads, you're going to uncompress the forks. You can do this a couple times to make sure there's no air bubbles in the forks, and just make sure the levels are even left to right up to the bottom of the threads. You can sort of see it in this video. There's the fork oil right to the bottom of the threads. We're going to lift the forks up, stick the spacers in, the cut spacers. They're sticking out here because the forks are compressed, but go ahead and lift the bike up. Those spacers should sit down right around the edge of the threads. There's going to be a little bit of preload on this because I only cut 1 inch off. But if you want your ride to be just a little bit softer, you can cut them off at 1.5 inches, but you really don't want to go any more than 1.5 inches, otherwise there'll be a gap between the top caps that I'm tightening up here and the spacers. You clearly can't have a gap, so you don't want to cut off more than 1.5 inches. You'll see what I'm talking about when you look down in the forks. So here I am tightening up the top caps. And like I mentioned earlier, it's all about where you cut the spacers at will completely determine the firmness of your ride. So if you cut off a little bit more, 1.5 inches, it's going to be a slightly softer ride. These are pretty thick springs. It's a pretty firm ride, so just be aware. And that's it. There you go. Enjoy the new front suspension.